What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. There are so many baits to choose from when fishing offshore for bass, and the list is getting bigger and bigger every year. So in this video, I want to share all of the offshore bass fishing lures that I've used to catch bass over the last 10 years, plus some baits I've seen pros use in tournaments, and try to categorize them in different groups, so you know which bait to pick based on the conditions and the lake you're on to catch as many offshore bass as possible. Let's get into it. First up, I want to be clear about what I mean when I say offshore bass fishing. Basically, in my opinion, offshore bass fishing is any time you're fishing more than one cast length away from the bank and you're fishing objects that are not visible to the naked eye. Usually you have to use your electronics like side imaging, down imaging, or forward-facing sonar to see these objects, and again, you're out in the middle of the lake, not right up against the shore. Now, in terms of the baits that I throw, there are so many to choose from, and I try to categorize them based on how I actually fish them and also the behavior of the bass that I actually am targeting. So in my personal experience, I've found that I can bucket my offshore lures into three general groups. Baits that are fished on the bottom of the lake, baits that are fished for suspended bass in the middle of the water column, and baits that are fished on the surface of the water for offshore bass that are within 0 to 5 feet of the surface. Within these categories, there's also subgroups. We have fast-moving baits and slow-moving baits. We also have finesse lures and power fishing lures. This is a lot of different little slices of the pie, different segments that we can put these baits into. So what I'm going to go through are all three of the major categories: bottom, suspended, and topwater, and also the subcategories within them, and list all the baits that I have spread out here in front of me into those categories and explain when to throw them, the best conditions, all those different things, so you guys have a great perspective on what baits are available for offshore fishing and maybe learn about some baits you've never thought about throwing for offshore bass. Let's start with my favorite category of baits, the suspended baits. The suspended category is focused on bass that are sitting in the middle of the water column, usually more than 5 feet off the bottom and more than 5 feet from the surface of the water. These suspended bass are tricky to target because you have to keep your bait at the exact level of those fish to get them to bite. Unlike the bottom baits that can just be fished on the bottom and you can know your bait's down there because you just see your line stop moving, or topwater baits that are sitting on the surface, suspended baits take a little bit more practice, expertise, and understanding to fish. And there are a lot of them to choose from, and again, more and more coming every single year, so I'm going to run through my favorites. First up, let's start with the suspended baits that are fast moving and power baits. When I mean fast moving, it means baits that are moving through the water pretty quickly, and power baits are going to be your bigger, bulkier baits to target more aggressive fish feeding on big bait. My couple favorites are going to be, first, a big swim bait. This is a Megabass Mag Draft Freestyle 6-inch swim bait on a 1-ounce underspin head. I like a heavier head on my big swim baits when I'm fishing for suspended bass because it allows me to reel that bait a little bit faster while keeping it in the middle of the water column. There are other smaller swim baits that work really well on this, like a Megabass Spark Shad 5-inch. You can even go to like a 3-inch or a 4-inch swim bait as well, but my personal preference is throw a little bit bigger swim bait because it seems to get me bigger bites. Another great option that you can throw in addition to a swim bait is a swim jig. I've talked about this in some recent videos, and I've caught some giants recently on this Megabass Uoze Swimmer swim jig with a Kitech 4.3 Fat Impact swim bait on the back. This little swim jig has an underspin on it and has a little bit beefier profile with a 3/4 ounce weight, and both these baits are pretty beefy in general. This skirted swim jig really imitates bluegill, in my opinion, a little bit better than the just standard single swim bait. So I'll kind of mix them in between, choosing both and trying to fish them again over the top of suspended bass. Nice thing about the swim jig is it does have that weed guard, which makes it a little bit better for fishing through cover as well. Another great bait in the power fishing category that's fast moving and targets suspended bass is a deep water spinnerbait. This is the Strike King Bottom Dweller spinnerbait. It's a 1 3/8 ounce spinnerbait that I upgraded with a size 8 Hildebrandt willow leaf blade. This is a massive blade that targets bigger shad, and that's why you want that heavier spinnerbait. It's over an ounce, and this big blade has a lot of kick to it and will keep that spinnerbait up in the water column. When you want to fish in dirtier water, let's say 1.5 to 3 foot of water visibility, and the fish are targeting shad, this big spinner bait is an awesome tool. Again, just fish it over the top of cover and over top of suspended bass, you'll catch some really good ones. Another great option for targeting these more aggressive fish is going to be a flutter spoon. Now, a flutter spoon is fished a little bit differently from the first 3 baits I showed. Basically, you're going to cast it out, let it hit the bottom, then rip it off the bottom 8 to 10 feet and let it fall through those suspended bass. This is a 6.5-inch Ben Parker flutter spoon, and this is an awesome bait for targeting schools of offshore bass that are suspended off the bottom, let's say 5 to 10 feet off the bottom, or maybe over the edge of a ledge. This bait requires some pretty beefy equipment, and you may lose a few fish on this bait. It takes a little bit getting used to, but once you start catching fish on this thing, you're going to catch a lot of good ones pretty quick. The last power moving rig that I fish for suspended bass is going to be an Alabama rig. These aren't allowed in all tournaments, and some states only allow you to have 1 hook on the Alabama rig, some allow you to have 3. In Arkansas here, we can have as many as 5, which is great, or maybe even up to 10, I'm not sure. So there's a lot. I just go with this 5 bait rig though. This is the Umbrella Flash Mob Junior umbrella rig with these are Megabass Hasdong shads in the 4-inch size with a 5-inch Megabass spark shad and these weedless Zorro swim bait jig heads. I'll link all the stuff down in the description, guys. It's gonna be a laundry list of baits down in the description. I'll bucket them in different categories so you guys can go check them out with Tackle Warehouse links, and it'll have all of the baits, everything we're talking about here with all the equipment. And the first rod I wanna talk about here is going to be the Denali Covert Light 7'6" medium heavy power fast action worm and jig rod. This 7'6" rod is great for handling these offshore baits. You can cast them a long way, and you can also get a lot of leverage on your hook set. The medium heavy power will handle baits up to 1 ounce, which is perfect for most of the baits we're talking about here. You may want to go to a heavy power rod, specifically for like the flutter spoon or that really big spinner bait. This rod will handle it okay, and it'll get the job done if you just want 1 rod, but going up to a heavy power may be also beneficial. But if you just want 1 rod to fish all the baits I just talked about, including the Alabama rig, going with the 7'6" medium heavy power rod is going to be the deal. I just pair that with a 7-to-1 gear ratio Abu Garcia Max Z reel, $50 reel I got at Academy Sports, and I put 16-pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon on this to fish all these baits. Great little setup, really versatile, and you actually can go down in the description, guys, and find a discount code where you can get 30% off your first order at denalirods.com. Pick up these rods at a 30% discount, so definitely check that out down in the description. Next up in the suspended category, we have our fast-moving finesse baits. These are baits that have a smaller profile than these big baits I talked about, and are targeting fish that are a little bit more finicky. The couple of baits I have in mind, first up is my trusty hair jig. This is one of my favorite baits, guys, for targeting aggressive offshore bass that want a smaller profile bait. The bigger swim baits here, these 5-inch swim baits, are just a little bit too bulky sometimes, especially if you're fishing for finicky largemouth or spotted bass and smallmouth. This hair jig is a Cumberland Pro half-ounce hair jig in the just white color. This has some blue in it, doesn't really matter, just a white hair jig. And the way you fish this is similar to the flutter spoon in that you let it go all the way to the bottom, burn it up off the bottom 8 to 10 feet, and let it fall through those suspended fish. Great little technique there, and catches a ton of good ones. Another great option is going to be a finesse swim bait. This, unlike the 5-inch swim bait, is a very small, finessey 3-inch Megabass spark shad on a 1/4 ounce ball head. These smaller swim baits work great again for finicky bass and also spotted bass and smallmouth. Usually I go to these finessier approaches on bluebird sky days when you have no wind, bright, sunny skies, and the fish are in that kind of post-spawn or less active mood. When the fish are really aggressive, if there's a lot of wind and cloud cover and stuff like that, that's when you can go to a bigger swim bait, a bigger flutter spoon, the Magnum spinner bait, stuff like that, and get those fish to bite. Another great option if you're trying to fish for some of those aggressive moving fish that are wanting a finessey profile is going to be this new sonar spin from Jewel. This is a really interesting little bait that they just came out with. It has a kind of shad style body and a compact spinnerbait look. It's a 1 ounce bait, and it has an interesting blade that has a twist to it, which is really cool. I'll link this down in the description. It's a brand new bait that I've been throwing a little bit from Jewel, and it's something I don't think these fish have really seen before. You basically just throw it around, reel it through schools of fish, suspended bass, and it's a faster moving bait, but it has a finessey profile, kind of a downsized version of the Magnum spinnerbait. And it's a great little deal that I don't think a lot of people have seen and a lot of fish have seen, so definitely check that out down in the description. Really quick, if you're enjoying the detailed instruction in this video, then head to our website, fishthemoment.com, and check out our virtual seminars page. Here you'll find seminar recordings from past seminars we've done on a variety of bass fishing topics, from seasonal bass movement, electronics, offshore bass fishing, and how weather affects bass. These are 3-hour seminars with extremely detailed graphics and instruction that we spend hours putting together so that they're extremely clear and impactful. If you want to take your fishing to the next level and enjoy the content on this channel, definitely check out our virtual seminars because I know you'll love the content. Check them out at fishthemoment.com. Now, most of the baits I've talked about are going to be targeting fish that are chasing bait fish and they're suspended out in the open. But sometimes bass will also suspend in the top of offshore grass. If you have lakes with a lot of grass, 2 great options are going to be a 3/4 ounce lipless crankbait, like the Strike King Red Eye Shad in the 3/4 ounce size, or a 1/2 ounce to 3/4 ounce chatterbait. This is a Z-Man jackhammer chatterbait with a Strike King Menace Grub trailer. Both these baits are great for working over the top of grass, ripping it out of the grass. I found that 3/4 ounce size works better in deeper water for me and gets some a little bit bigger bites. So I go with that 3/4 ounce size. And then that 1/2 ounce to 3/4 ounce Z-Man jackhammer is also a great option fishing through grass for those suspended fish. Next up in the suspended bass category, we have the slow moving baits. First up, we'll talk about slow-moving power baits. And really the only one I have in this category is going to be a jerk bait. There are a lot of different jerk baits on the market, so there's a lot of versatility in this category. We have, for example, right here, a Megabass Vision 110 Plus 2 jerk bait. This bait has a really great side-to-side action and can be worked aggressively, but because it's a suspending jerk bait, it can also just sit in the water column dead still and not move at all. This makes it a great option for targeting fish that want an aggressive moving bait, but that's not moving fast through the water column. Unlike a swim bait that has to be reeled constantly to keep the action going, that jerk bait can just be kind of cast out there and let hang in front of those fish's face, then give some erratic jerks, and then pause again right in front of those fish. And sometimes they just absolutely can't stand it. This bait usually works better when you have some sort of wind, a little bit of cloud cover, something like that to get the fish somewhat aggressive, but they will bite this too on clear bluebird sky days. Now, another great option for these suspending jerk baits is going to be the Smithwick Perfect 10 Rogue. It's a really big jerk bait that dives 10 feet deep, and I actually caught a 10-pounder on this a couple of years ago. My only 10-pound bass, and it's an absolutely awesome bait. Has a little bit different action from that Vision 110 Plus 2, but dives to about the same depth, and again, it's a suspending jerk bait that works awesome. For these suspending jerk baits, my go-to setup is going to be a Denali Lithium Pro 7-foot medium power, moderate action crankbait rod. I like a 7-foot rod with these offshore jerk baits and all these offshore baits because it gives me a little bit more control over those fish, lets me cast the bait further, and also lets me get a little more leverage on my hook sets. I'll pair that, this is just a Cast King Mag Jaws 7-to-1 gear ratio, $60 reel I got off Amazon, and I'll pair that with 12-pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon. So this rod is honestly a great option for the last category we talked about, the suspended baits that are finessey, fast moving, but also your power slow moving baits can both be thrown on this 7-foot medium power Denali crankbait rod. Now for your more finessey, slow moving baits in the suspended category, we have a few more options. First up is my go-to favorite, a Neko rig. This is a missile bait 6.5-inch quiver worm with a 3/32 ounce nail weight in the tail and an owner Neko weedless hook on there as well. You just put an O-ring on that and you can work that thing through the middle of the water column, working over the top of the suspended bass, letting it fall through them, and just kind of watching it on your forward-facing sonar or letting it hit the bottom, working at 8 to 10 feet off the bottom, letting it fall through those suspended bass. It kind of works similar to a hair jig, but because it's so much lighter than the hair jig with that nail weight, it falls very, very slow and will get those fish to react that may not touch the hair jig because they're not that aggressive. It's just an awesome, finessey, slow-moving bait for suspended bass. And with the weedless hook, you can fish around brush piles, timber, docks, pretty much anywhere bass are going to suspend, catch some really good fish. Another great option for the finessey, slow-moving baits is going to be your spy bait. A spy bait is kind of interesting because it does require it to be reeled through the middle of the water column, but it sinks so slow, especially this Duo Realis Spin Bait 80, that you have to reel it on a spinning rod just as slow as you can possibly stand it to keep that thing just creeping through the water. And when you're fishing this thing in 8, 12, 15 feet of water, if you just turn that reel handle, just barely turning it, it will keep that bait moving forward, but it'll almost stay perfectly in place. And it works almost as well as a jerk bait in terms of targeting those suspended bass that want a bait that's barely moving. But because it has a different profile than the jerk bait and is smaller, a lot of times you can get more bites on this than the jerk baits. A couple other baits that would work in this category are going to be a tiny little 1/16 or 1/8 ounce crappie hair jig. This is something I see a lot of pros throwing that they're not talking about. This is a little Spro crappie hair jig that's a little bit bigger than your standard crappie jig, but it is, again, like 1/16 to 1/8 ounce, and it falls super slow through the water column, small, tiny profile, but sometimes when those bass are feeding on little shad, you can catch some giant bass on this little tiny hair jig. A couple more options are going to be baits that are still finessey, and they're not necessarily slow moving, but they're actually fished vertically. And these are going to be baits that you want to basically just cast right out in front of your trolling motor, watch go down to the fish on your graph, and then fish vertically over the top of those fish. Some of those options are going to be an ice fishing jig. This is a Rapala jigging wrap. There's actually the flat wrap as well that has a heavier weight, 1 3/4 or 1 3/8 I think, and it has a lot wider tail to it. This is just a standard jigging wrap that's like 7/8 of an ounce, and basically you just work this thing vertically over fish. And a lot of times guys are catching them on table rock in the winter or in the fall in 50 to 80 feet of water. Bass, catching them 50 to 80 feet deep vertically on this type of bait. And it works absolutely great for those suspended bass that are chasing schools of baitfish in ditches and drains in, let's say, 20 to 80 feet of water. Usually this jigging wrap is better here in the 20 to 40 foot range. The flat wrap is better in that 50+ foot range. You can also throw the Jewel Scuba Spoon, which is a 1 ounce spoon that can be worked, again, in that 40 to 80 foot range. Another great option for vertical fishing that's kind of finessey is a Demiki rig. This is a little Jenko fishing tremor shad, just a little hand-poured swim bait I like to throw, 3 inches long on a Demiki rig head. This is a 3/8 ounce Demiki rig head. It has a vertical line tie, and all you do is drop that bait straight down, shake it in front of those fish's face, and they'll absolutely chew it up. For baits in the slow-moving finesse category and those vertical baits, my go-to rod is going to be this Denali Lithium Pro 7'4" medium heavy power multi-purpose spinning rod. This rod is pretty long, 7'4" so it gives you a lot of leverage when that bait is far away from the boat, has good hook setting power, but also has enough bend to it that you can fish both treble hook baits and lighter hooked baits as well. Now, if you want to have very specific specialized rods, you can get a really specialized rod for like the spy baits that are maybe like a moderate action and a medium power. But honestly, if you're just getting started offshore fishing, picking up this one multi-purpose spinning rod will get you started and will cover most of your bases. I'll pair that with whatever spinning reel I have around. This is a very old Quantum Smoke reel. I also use these Abu Garcia Max Pro reels. They're $50 from Walmart. And I'll pair that with 20-pound Sunline braided line as my main line, and I'll tie a leader of 6-pound FC Sniper fluorocarbon leader line. I like 6-pound tests when I'm fishing with these spinning rods as much as possible because it gives me enough strength to fish or pull the fish away from the cover usually, but it's smaller diameter line than most people throw, so it gives me a few extra bites. I'll connect my main line braid to about a 30 to 50 foot leader of this fluorocarbon using an FG knot. You can find FG nuts on YouTube, just Google them or search them on YouTube and you're good to go. Again, all this stuff's gonna be linked down in the description below. And that's basically all of the baits in the suspended category. Next up, let's move to the bottom baits. Now the bottom bait category is the more traditional category, I would say, for offshore bass fishing, and one that you guys may be more comfortable with. But there are still a lot of options in this category. Let's start with the fast moving power baits. The number one fast moving power bait that's synonymous with offshore bass fishing is a deep diving crankbait. This is a striking 6XD. It's caught me a ton of big fish over the years, and it is worked by cranking it around cover and actually deflecting it off objects around the bottom of the lake. When fish are aggressively feeding, you have a lot of current or wind, bass are going to chew this deep diving crankbait, and it works really well in depths from 10 to about 18 feet of water. Another couple crankbaits I like to throw for these aggressive bass is going to be a KVD 8.0 square bill by Strike King. This works a lot better in the, let's say, 2 to 5 to 8 foot range offshore, but it still has a big profile and catches some giant fish, especially into the fall and in the post spawn. Another great option that is still a power bait but has a little bit smaller profile is a Spro Rock Crawler 55. This thing dives 6 to 12 feet deep, and it has a nice wide wobble that works great all through the winter time as long as water temperatures are above 48 degrees, and excels anytime the water is between like 48 and 75 degrees and when you're targeting crawfish. For these baits, I like to throw all of these on a little bit bigger crankbait rod. This is actually a Denali Covert Light 7'6" medium heavy power moderate action crankbait rod. The 7'6" rod is a little bit longer, lets you make long casts to get these baits offshore, but it has a lot of bend to it so that the treble hooks don't pull out of the fish's mouth. On this rod I have another great deep diver, which is the Spro Little John DD70, great little deep diving crankbait as well. And I'll pair that with a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel. This is a 5.4-to-1 gear ratio max winch reel I got for 50 bucks at Walmart, and I'm pairing that with 12-pound FC Sniper fluorocarbon from Sunline. And basically I like a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel because it helps you crank a little bit easier, you don't wear yourself out as much, and it helps get that bait down to depth by really winching it down at those more aggressive baits. If you're throwing like these little rock crawlers and stuff like that that have less pull to them, you can get away with a 6-3-to-1 or 7-to-1 gear ratio reel. But if you're going for the really big deep divers, go with a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel. It'll save your arm if you throw them all day long. Now, in terms of the finesse category for these fast moving baits, I do have two options, and it's two different crankbaits. First one is going to be a brand new bait by Megabass that I don't really want to talk about because it's so good, and I haven't really had time to exploit it yet on these lakes, but I'm going to share it with you guys in this video. And it's the Megabass Super Z3 crankbait. It is a tiny little bait that dives 12 feet deep and is an absolute fish catcher, guys. Like I don't really want to talk about it because it's so good, but here I am. And basically it has such a small profile, but it dives, you know, almost as deep as this 6XD, not quite as deep, but almost as deep. And it's just a great little shad imitator, crawfish imitator, and you can go right behind other guys in offshore spots and hammer them on this little tiny crankbait. So cat's out of the bag, Megabass Super Z3 crankbait, link them in the description. Didn't want to talk about that one, but here we are. Another bait that I've talked about before, I didn't want to talk about this in the past, but I've mentioned it now enough that people know about it, is this little custom balsa flat side crankbait. This is a Striking custom shop, but there's also a new one. It's like a PH Customs flat side crankbait. This little crankbait is deadly when water temperatures are below 60 degrees. I've caught several 8-pounders on this bait, won a bunch of tournaments back in the day on this lure. It dives 4 to 8 feet deep, made of balsa wood, has a really tight wiggle, and is great for fishing those shallower offshore spots that are in 4 to 8 foot. Again, offshore bass fishing, all it means in my opinion is you're fishing objects that are not visible to the naked eye and that are more than the cast length away from the bank. So basically you could be fishing a big flat that's 4 feet deep with stumps that aren't visible, and this bait is an absolute killer on those. For these fast moving finesse baits on the bottom, I'm gonna go back to this 7-foot medium power, moderate action crankbait rod that I was using for the jerk baits earlier. You can use the same line, the same setup. My goal here with these rods, guys, is to give you 4 rods that can do almost everything. There are specific rods that might work better or be a little more specialized, but just getting started in offshore fishing, again, these 4 rods will keep it simple and help you throw most of these baits. Next up, we have the slow-moving bottom baits. We'll start with the power category. My #1 power slow-moving bait offshore is my Fish the Moment offshore jig. This is a 5/8 ounce football jig with a double cable weed guard that comes through brush better than any football jig on the market. Honestly, if you're a new offshore angler and you want to catch some big fish offshore with a slow-moving bottom bait, this Fish the Moment offshore jig is the way to go. It catches giant fish in grass, wood, rocks, pretty much anywhere you want to throw it. And I'll pair that with my own personally designed craw chunk trailer, which is the Jewel VersaCraw Junior trailer in the green pumpkin color. And my favorite color of this jig is just a peanut butter and jelly color. This bait, again, can be fished as shallow as 5 feet of water out to 40 feet of water in a variety of cover, and it works on pretty much every lake type you're ever going to find. So this is definitely my go-to offshore bottom slow-moving bait. Now, I also throw a few other power baits in the slow-moving category that work great as well. One of them is the Magnum Shaky Head. This is just a Zoom Magnum trick worm with an Excite 5/8 ounce jig head. Basically just a big shaky head that works really great dragging around the bottom in the same areas you're going to throw the football jig. This works through brush piles, rock piles. Not as great through grass, but it definitely gives a big profile that gets a lot of big bites. Another big worm to throw is a Zoom Old Monster. This is on a more traditional Texas rig, and this actually comes through brush better than that shaky head. Shaky head's better through rocks usually, and then the Texas rig with like a 3/8 ounce Denali tungsten weight with this 10.5 inch Zoom Old Monster is really good in brush piles. These football jigs and big worms are kind of interchangeable in the summertime, but I find the football jig works better in colder months, water temperatures below 75 degrees. And then as water temperatures get above 75 degrees, they're both effective, but the big worm also becomes a big player as you fish these beefier, more aggressive bottom baits. Another great bait in the bottom category that kind of is a slow-moving and a fast-moving bait and also can be finessey or power is a swing head. This is a Jean Leroux hard head swing head, anywhere from like a 5/16 to an 11/16 ounce size. It has a 3 or 4 out hook depending on the size you get, and I just put a creature bait on the back if I want a more power approach, like this Jean Leroux biffle bug, or you can go with a more finessier approach with like a Strike King menace grub on the back of that swing head. Both baits work really great. They just target different fish depending on their mood. The more inactive fish tend to prefer a more finessey bait like this biffle or like the menace grub, and then the more active fish prefer that biffle bug. And the way you fish this bait is you like it down the rocks and you just reel it really slow through the area. Sometimes you can stop it, sometimes you can burn it and speed it up. And it works great just through any sort of rocky cover, and sometimes can also come through brush depending on the style of bait you're throwing. For all these slow moving bottom baits, I'm gonna be throwing them on that 7'6" medium heavy power worm and jig rod I mentioned earlier. It works great for these bigger swim baits, also works great with a football jig, big worms, swing heads, and it's just a great all around offshore rod for your single hook baits and something you want to get a good hook set on. Next up, we have the slow moving bottom baits in the finesse category, and there are a lot of options here. A couple of the most popular are going to be the Ned rig, which is just a little 3-inch finesse TRD by Z-Man on a little Shrooms jig head. Just drag this thing on the bottom around rocks or grass, catches a ton of fish. Another option is going to be a drop shot. And a drop shot actually kind of can double as one of these suspended baits that targets those suspended bass that are in the middle of the water column. I didn't really add it in this category over here, the suspended category, just for the sake of the video, but you can also fish this drop shot in the same situations as a Demiki rig or as the jigging spoon, but you can also just cast it around in the same areas you would throw a Ned rig. Drop shot is basically just a hook with a worm, and then you have a weight that is anywhere from 8 to 20 inches below the worm is above the weight, and you tie a Palomar knot onto your hook to be able to get that weight below it. There's a bunch of videos that explain how to do a drop shot, and it's a very versatile technique that catches them all around the country. A couple other finessey rigs you can throw. Another great one is a shaky head. This is just a black zoom trick worm on a jewel squirrel head, 1/4 ounce shaky head. Works great dragging on rocks, brush, any sort of offshore cover, and is a great alternative to a football jig or a big worm. When the fish aren't really committing to the jig, a lot of times they'll eat that shaky head, and you'll get a few extra bites on your spots. A few other baits that you can throw, especially if you're in smallmouth country, is a little finesse tube. This is a 3.5-inch Strike King coffee tube. You can just insert a tube jig head in here, drag it around the bottom, in the same places you fish your Ned rigs, your shaky head, stuff like that. A few more options we have here are the Jewel Pee-wee football jig. This is a little 7/16 ounce tiny football jig that's pretty heavy, so it can be fished pretty deep, but it has a really tiny profile. Again, a great alternative to the bigger football jig. I'll throw this with a Jewel VersaCraw in the Pee-wee size. It's the Pee-wee size Jewel VersaCraw, and it works great on that Pee-wee football jig. And the last option I have here is a Carolina rig. Carolina rig is basically a long leader with a little creature bait and just a straight shank offset worm hook. And then you have your swivel with a weight and a bead. It's a great way to get a bait to kind of sit above the fish, just a little bit off the bottom, drag it across the bottom of the lake, and it catches a lot of great fish. Kind of a forgotten rig, but it definitely still catches fish. For most of these rigs, other than the Carolina rig, I'm going to be throwing it on that same spinning rod I mentioned earlier, the 7'4" multi-purpose. Then for the Carolina rig, I'll put it on that 7'6" bait casting rod, and you're good to go. Again, goal is to get you the fewest number of rods possible to fish as many baits as possible. And then there's one more category of bottom baits that's a little bit unique that I'm going to mention, and that is your vibrating bottom baits. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The first one that comes to mind is this Scrounger head. Scrounger head is a swim bait style bait with a lip on the front that vibrates, and usually are fishing a straight tail swim bait on the back, like this Jenko Fishing Tremor Shad on this Tremor head. I'll go with a 3/4 ounce to 1.25 ounces with these really big 7-inch swim baits, and then I'll go with like a 1/2 ounce or a 3/4 ounce size on these smaller like 5-inch swim baits. The idea with these Scrounger heads is that they make a lot of commotion, they vibrate side to side, kick that tail around a lot, and they work great fish close-ish to the bottom, within 2 to 3 feet off the bottom, and you can kind of kill them, pop them up off the bottom, swim them through schools of fish, and when fish are less aggressive, a lot of times they'll bite these Tremor Shads. I wouldn't say they're necessarily in the same category as a swim bait, because a swim bait is definitely designed to be fished more in the middle of the water column, where these Scrounger heads are more effective closer to the bottom, around shell beds, on the lips of ledges, stuff like that, and maybe just fish just off the edge of a ledge versus up in the middle of the water column. Another great bait that mimics the same style is a Magnum chatterbait. This here is the Picasso 1-ounce mega bladed chatterbait. It has a massive blade, heavy head, and it works just like a standard chatterbait, but it just has a lot bigger profile, makes a lot more vibration, and it's a lot heavier to be fished deep in the water. My favorite way to fish it is to cast it out, let it hit the bottom, burn the reel handle 5 or 6 times, and then let it fall back down to the bottom nice and slow, and it can get some really big bites. It's something the fish don't really see that much. The last bait in this category is a blade bait. This is the Ledge Hog 3/4 ounce 3-inch blade bait, though there are a lot of other good ones on the market. This bait works really great in the winter time and when bass are positioned tight to rocks and to the bottom. Just pulse that bait up off the bottom 5 or 6 feet, let it fall back down, raise it up, let it fall back down, and it works great whenever that water temperature is below like 60 degrees. It's also a great smallmouth bait if you go with like a 2-inch blade bait in the 1/2 ounce size. There's a bunch of them out there, and I'll link a few more down in the description. For all these baits, again, throwing on that 7'6", medium heavy action bait casting rod, and it gets the job done. Last but not least, we have the topwater category. This is the category that I use the least, honestly, and I don't have that many baits that I throw in this category, though there are probably a lot more that I'm missing that will also work here. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it's one of the ones that I've caught fish on. These topwater baits work great in the summertime when you're on clear water lakes and fishing over the top of standing timber or brush piles. You can also catch them in the post-spawn and even sometimes in the pre-spawn over shallower stumps and shell beds and things like that. And they also work great in the fall on big offshore flats. A couple of go-to baits I like to throw. One is a really big evergreen SB 150 walking style, like cane style bait. It is this massive pencil popper. I don't know exactly what you would call this, but it's just a really big bait with a treble hook on the back that has some feathers, and it is a really big bait that draws a lot of commotion. One thing about fishing topwaters offshore is that you need to draw fish to the bait. And so the bigger the profile of your bait, the more commotion it makes in the water, the more fish are going to draw up to the surface. A lot of times with this bait, I'll fish it in clear water lakes and I'll pull fish out of 10 to 15 feet of water, and they'll be 10 to 15 feet below the bait, and they'll see it on the surface and come all the way up out of the top of a tree to come eat it. You can also throw this bait in a more matte finish or like a bone color and fish it up on shallower flats around shell beds and stumps, and also get some really vicious bites if you have overcast skies and fish that are roaming. A couple other baits that work really well are wake baits, wake style baits. One of them is this Berkeley surge shad. It's also the cotton cordell redfin is another option. Basically, these baits have a waking style to them, and they make commotion on the water as they wake, and they make some sound, and they'll draw fish in clear water up out of deeper water. Great for spotted bass, for big largemouth on clear water lakes in the summer, and made famous really fishing Lake Washita by Scott Suggs, catching them out of standing timber. The bass would come 20 feet out of those trees, from 20 feet of water up, to eat this topwater walking bait, or this wake bait. Another great option is this Megabass eye-jack wake bait. I catch a bunch of big fish on Table Rock throwing this bait. Just another wake bait that puts off a lot of vibration and a lot of commotion on the surface. I've caught some good ones on this in the late summer, fishing over the top of brush piles and standing timber. And then the last topwater bait I throw is a little bit more finessey, and that is a fluke. This is a Strike King 5-inch caffeine shad. I'll just rig it weightless on a 6/0 EWG hook, and I'll try to fish it within 1 to 2 feet of the surface. Cast it out, work it really quick across the top of the surface, maybe stop it for a second to let it fall, then work it really fast again near the surface. Sometimes when the bass are unwilling to commit to a big topwater like this, they'll bite the caffeine shad and actually get it in their mouth. Another great bait for actually targeting that suspended topwater bass that's just below the surface is going to be the spy bait I talked about earlier. The little spy bait is very light, and you can fish it within 2 to 3 feet of the surface, and this little spy bait sometimes will get bit just as well, if not better, than that fluke for those subsurface bass. You can also fish this fluke and this spy bait deeper by letting them sink really, really slowly, counting them down 15 or 20 seconds and fishing them deep. So they're both kind of a suspended and topwater category bait. And honestly, a lot of these baits can be fished in multiple categories, multiple styles, and there are a lot of baits I didn't even talk about despite how long this video is. In terms of the rods, again, guys, basically my rule of thumb, especially for these topwater baits with treble hooks, is to fish either this 7-foot medium power crankbait rod for your smaller treble hook baits offshore. For your bigger treble hook baits like the deep diving crankbait or maybe this bigger walking topwater, go for that 7'6" medium heavy power moderate action crankbait rod. For all of your single hook baits, whether that's a swim bait, the jigs, the worms, where you need to get a good hook set and have some backbone, that 7'6" medium heavy power worm and jig rod works great. And then for all of your smaller, finessier baits that are lighter and have smaller hooks, go with the spinning rod, the 7-foot, 4-inch multi-purpose spinning rod by Denali. All these rods are linked down below, and honestly, between these 4 rods, you're going to have everything you need to start fishing offshore. My recommendation is pick a couple of baits in each category that appeal to you. You don't need to learn all of them at once. Goal of this video wasn't to overwhelm you with the number of bait options. And also, like I mentioned, these are not all of the offshore baits that are out there. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just what I throw. So you can see there's so many different ways to get it done offshore. Pick a couple baits you like, pick up a couple rods, and just start fishing offshore. Give it a shot. If you guys need help learning how to fish offshore, how to use your electronics, anything like that, I have a ton of videos on this channel, Fish the Moment, to help you get started. Subscribe to the Fish the Moment YouTube channel if you want more content like this. And also, if you made it all the way to this point in the video, I would definitely consider you a bass fishing nerd just like me. So let me know if you made it to the end here. It's great to see how many people actually watch the entire video and who are interested. So again, thanks for checking out this video, and we'll see y'all in the next one.